And so who's going first? Is it Mary Pat or Kevin?
I'll defer to the person in charge at the USCCB, and I can sort of talk about on the ground level. So.
Oh.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, it's great to be back here with you talking about something that is absolutely dear to my heart. And I just want to say, too, you know, when you talk about Catholic identity, this is not something that is separate from what I'm about to talk about. In fact, what I'm about to talk about will incarnate that Catholic identity even more fully in your school. And I just want to give you a little microcosm of a background. I was principal of St. Jerome's in Hyattsville, Maryland, became principal back in 2009. It was a pretty typical parochial school. It had, parish was founded in 1886, the school in 1943. In the heydays of the early 60s, it had 1,000 kids. You know the story. When I began teaching, we still had 560 kids. That was in 1990. But by 2000, in the early 2000s, we began a steep, precipitous decline, landing at about 240 kids enrolled in 2009 and dropping. Meanwhile, maybe some of you have this experience in your own parishes. We had a growing number of young families. Many of them were affiliated with Catholic University, which was only a couple miles down the road from us. And these growing young families were all homeschooling their children. They wanted nothing to do with the parish school. And in the course of this transition, I came to understand what their criticism was. Many of them simply felt that Catholic schools, and that one as well, had abandoned a sense of Catholic pedagogy and curriculum. So when our school ended up really on the rocks, we were actually told by the Archdiocese that unless we could produce some sort of a way forward, we could not begin registration for the following year. This, of course, was, a tremendous crisis for us, but members of that parish stepped up and they came to Father Stack and to me and they said, we'd like to help you if you're willing to reimagine your school. And what was interesting was that all volunteer group came together, they researched curricula, couldn't find anything that quite fit. And I'll talk a little bit about that next. And I'm going to push back on just a little bit on that word classical. I think it's important to bear something in mind. The reason my curriculum committee couldn't really find anything is, yes, there's lots of classical curricula out there. Most of it, by the way, in evangelical Protestant circles, which is fascinating because, of course, much of it comes from the very Greco-Roman roots of the church. But anyway, classical is sort of an incomplete label for what we mean. And a colleague of mine from the ICLE, Elizabeth Sullivan, says the word classical refers to our roots, but the word liberal, freedom, refers to our ends. So we tend to call it sort of a Catholic liberal. The word classical, though, does have a purpose, and I'll tell you, I think, what that is. You may remember several decades ago when Coca-Cola changed its formula and we had New Coke. Does anyone remember that? It was terrible. People hated it. And so when Coke finally got the message and they reissued it as Classic Coke to sort of distinguish for people. I think that's the purpose of the word classical. We're using it to distinguish something that was the original. And for us as Catholics, that original is the Catholic liberal tradition. The notion that there is a Catholic curriculum, of course, remember the word curriculum simply means the way. So obviously, Catholic education has different ends. We often say, our ends are eternal life for our children. So it makes no sense that our way wouldn't also be distinct. And then, of course, the pedagogy, right, which is, of course, from the Greek word referring to child and leader, the idea of transmitting knowledge and culture and faith generationally from a teacher to students. So I'm going to read to you, if you'll bear with me, the vision statement that was written for St. Jerome's, because I think this really encapsulates what I mean. It says, St. Jerome Academy educates children in the truest and fullest sense by giving them the necessary tools of learning and by fostering wonder and love for all that is genuinely true, good, and beautiful. We emphasize classical learning because we want our students to read well, speak well, and think well, and ultimately because truth and beauty are good in themselves and desirable for their own sake. We seek to incorporate our students into the wisdom of 2,000 years of Catholic thought, history, culture, and arts, so that they might understand themselves and their world in the light of the truth and acquire the character to live happy and integrated lives in the service of God and others. Education in this deep and comprehensive sense extends beyond the classroom and is more than just the acquisition of skills. It encompasses the whole of one's life. For this reason, St. Jerome seeks to involve families ever more deeply in the life of the school and in the education of their children. So in that vision statement, I'm just going to unpack a few things for you. And my purpose behind this is to emphasize, how critically important the pastor is in this. The ability of the pastor to support it, articulate it, and sort of cheerlead us the whole way, which is really what Father Stack did. And Father Hisrich, I know you remember Father Stack from the Mount, and he played rugby when he was in the seminary. So he did quite a lot of blocking for us at the school because this kind of change did not come easily, as you might imagine in your parishes. So a couple of things about this concept of Catholic pedagogy and curriculum. And the first and most important thing is that it is a logocentric approach. It is a deliberate recognition of Jesus Christ as Logos, in whom all things cohere. Therefore, it's an integrated approach. And the integration of this knowledge isn't something that we do, but rather something that we reveal. So you probably immediately realizing, boy, teachers have to be in a position of humility and to receive this and to begin to rethink their understanding of the world. So the first is logocentrism. All things cohere in Christ, therefore knowledge is related. It's not the assembly line that John Dewey gave us at the beginning of the last century, where history has nothing to do with math and has nothing to do with science, and etc. And unfortunately, that has happened to all, I think, American contemporary curriculum, and sadly, Catholic schools have followed that and are struggling because of that inherent weakness. They're struggling to always try to infuse Catholic identity. You probably hear this all the time. Oh, we infuse Catholic identity, but you're already accepting a premise that contradicts something that the church deeply believes. So that's the first thing, logocentrism. The second thing is the deliberate cultivation of the aptitudes and habits that are inherent to the human person. We have been made to behold. We have been made to love. We have been made to choose. We have been made to name. So the way we educate children should really work to build that up. For example, from the time our kids at St. Jerome's were very little, kindergarten, first grade, there's a great emphasis placed on careful observation and rendering. So they'll go outside, they'll find leaves, they'll carefully look at them, they'll draw them. You never really see something until you have to draw it. Then you have to pay attention to the shape, the contour, the color. This isn't so much so that they become experts in what leaves look like, but rather so that their minds begin to be formed to look closely and deeply. And this, of course, when you're in nature, naturally sparks wonder. The Greeks told us that wisdom begins in wonder. So it's an important part of the education process for them to do that. It's also a good precursor to reading, and frankly, a really good precursor to doing science later. Secondly would be things like classifying. They should be able to sort. They should be able to look at the attributes, the essence and purpose and nature of things, and begin to classify them. We also want them to behold what is beautiful. So at St. Jerome's, if you were to visit there now, the school's going through a renovation. We have in the center hall a fresco of the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament by Raphael. And then on the floor above it, we have the School of Athens. Why? Because that's the tradition. There's the faith and reason tradition of the church. These are Catholic students. They should know it. We want them to behold it. They're fascinated by it. They walk. I mean, believe me, it's got all kinds of protective things so that the smudgies won't hurt it. But we want them to behold what is beautiful, to learn to do that. That also speaks to something we mentioned yesterday, which is Eucharistic adoration. You can start this, in small age-appropriate doses, but you're cultivating silence. You're cultivating the ability to behold our Lord. In terms of some basic principles, the one I think that really precedes all in terms of pedagogy is this idea of imitation before invention. In the modern classroom, there is a huge premium placed on this idea of creativity and originality. That's fine, except that it flies in the face of what historically has been true. You and I know that the masters of art, the masters of music, the great writers, all began by imitating those who had come before them. Imitation is innate to the human person. It's how we learn to speak. We imitate what we hear. That's how language develops. And that has to continue into the classroom so that we give them excellent models to imitate so that they learn the habits, the academic habits and virtues that will eventually allow them to, in fact, create. I think the contradiction there is that we see in the modern world, we tend to see creation as something that's spontaneous and just driven by this gift, when in fact, creativity is the result of disciplined work. A similar concept corollary would be this idea of forming a moral imagination, or a sacramental imagination, if you will, which is critical for Catholic school kids. I know you're all aware of the recent Pew research, the Pew study that talked about how little belief there is in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And I think part of this is because we do not teach our kids about the supernatural world. There's very little metaphysical experience for the average elementary school child. And again, some of that is because in modernity, we see imagination as being just a creative process, whereas the origins of the word refer to the ability to image reality. So small children should have opportunities to image reality through things like fairy tales and myths, the understanding that there are supernatural realities that surround the physical world. This, of course, builds to the use of the 7 liberal arts, the arts of language, which are grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the arts of number, originally arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, but I think now more coming to understand the numbers, the math, and the sciences. So this is not an abandonment of what you hear when you hear STEM. Everybody runs around talking about how important STEM is, and Catholic schools should embrace STEM. Well, sure, because these are wonderful disciplines that lead to an understanding of the beauty of the created order, but you don't need to do them on the terms of modernity, which is simply to have a good job waiting for you, but rather do them according to the ancient way that people approached and learned these subjects. In terms of the content, think about what is it that a Catholic school child should know. I mean, first and foremost, we want to only introduce them to what is good and true and beautiful. So looking at the time-tested classics of literature, poetry, scripture, certainly understanding the beauty of the Psalms, We also want to make sure that they understand both salvation history and Western civilization. Now, why is that? Well, we are products of the West. And the church was born into the Greco-Roman world. It's important that our kids understand that world and then understand the development of Christendom throughout the Middle Ages, and then begin to see the shift as man's gaze shifts away from God and to himself. We can trace many, many things. It helps them to understand their place in the world today. And of course, all of this is presented thematically and with a high degree of integration. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, wow, how did you get teachers to do this? And I'll say, first of all, it took a long time. It took us time to build up, to be able to master this. I didn't have any trouble finding teachers. I will tell you that. The storm that began this whole process ushered a few people out the door, which was actually good. And then I was able to bring people in simply by, advertising that vision statement. I had some of the best, finest, most ardent, faithful Catholic young people lining up at the door wanting to teach at St. Jerome's. And I've seen that in other schools. After my time at St. Jerome's, I spent 2 years traveling around the country with the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education and bringing this model to schools and dioceses. And I said, you know what, be at peace. You're going to find that there are teachers out there who have been waiting and hoping for something like this. And there are families out there who have been also waiting and hoping for this type of approach. So I will wrap up with just a few questions these are sort of self-evaluation questions that we used at St. Jerome's. All of these questions and the vision statement, plus much more, is available in the educational plan of St. Jerome's, which is available online. The best place to snatch it is from the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education website. So if you're interested in reading the full plan, the principal author of the plan is Dr. Michael Hanby of the Pontifical John Paul II Institute. So certainly invite you to take a look. But we'll wrap up my segment with just some of the self-evaluative questions that the curriculum committee left us. Is it beautiful? Are we doing this because it is inherently good or as a means to an end? If the latter, what end? Does it encourage reverence for the mystery of God?
I'm in the middle of a Zoom conference, so I don't have too much time.
Does it encourage reverence for the mystery of the human person and respect for the student's own human dignity? Does it help the student to see what difference God makes to all facets of the world, or does it make God's existence seem irrelevant, trivial, small, or private? Does it help to develop the fullest extent what is uniquely human in the student, the powers of attending, deliberating, questioning, calculating, remembering, and loving? Does it encourage the student to become patient, to take time, and if necessary, to start over in order to achieve excellence? Or does it subordinate excellence to speed, ease, and efficiency? So these are just some of the guidelines that our teachers routinely use. And just as a final note, I started by saying this. I can tell you this. The transition of St. Jerome to a fully Catholic liberal approach sparked a similar transition in a number of schools. Many, many places adopted our plan. And it has grown across the country. There are whole dioceses. The Diocese of Marquette is ordered to something like this. But I'm going to tell you, it would not have happened without the leadership and the inspiration of our pastor. And that was my experience in other schools. I would have principals call me and say, I really want to do this. Well, how does your pastor feel about it? And in cases where the pastor was not in favor, it's just not going to happen. Conversely, I've had pastors contact me and say, I really like this. I want to do this in my school. I'm having a hard time with the principal. But you know what, Father, you're the pastor. So we can make this work. So there's nothing more critical than your pastoral leadership. And certainly, because it is a love of mine, I'd be happy to talk with any of you individually if you were interested. Thank you.
Mary Pat, a couple of questions. What's the enrollment at St. Jerome's today? Do you know?
It's over 400. It's about 415 right now with wait list.
Good. I should mention to our participants, I think it was the first year of your program, I came for a day-long visit, and it was a wonderful experience. The kids start learning Latin in first grade, and by accident, the first class I visited was a first grade class, and they were in Latin study at the time. Now, of course, it's baby Latin, but they speak baby English too. So, and of course, all the data tell us that the sooner someone starts to learn a language, the easier it is and the greater retention possibility. But they were doing some little conversational stuff. So I said, "Quid agis?" And this little guy in the front row said, "Bene." And I said to another kid, "Quid agis?" And he said, "Optime." Oh. I went to a third kid and I said, "Quid agis?" And he said, "Pessime." But delightful, charming, huh? And I've got to put in here a real serious push for the study of Latin. I'm firmly convinced that no American kid will ever know English grammar unless he has studied Latin. And it has, and it has all kinds of cultural and ecclesiastical reasons behind it as well, huh? So, the obvious in terms of, we belong to the Latin rite of the Catholic Church. And it's rather bizarre that not only the kids don't know, but that priests don't know Latin is a real crime, huh? But so for liturgical purposes, of course, for the music that has come down to us down the centuries, huh? Whether it's Gregorian chant or Renaissance polyphony, and ironically, you'll find public school choruses learning Gregorian chant and Renaissance polyphony and doing it at concerts, and at school masses in many of the Catholic parishes, they're still doing Haagen-Dazs music, absurd, completely absurd. But also, it gives us a frame of reference and a way of approaching reality and communication. And a number of years ago, I was a weekend assistant at a Jersey Shore parish, and my Sunday homilies are normally 3 to 5 minutes, 2 to 3 type pages, one clear thought, and so on. And at the end of Mass, as I was glad-handing people, some elderly woman, very, very well-spoken, well-dressed, and sort of with the old world New York accent. "Good morning, Father," she said. "That was a splendid homily." And I really identified her then clearly as a woman of insight and taste. And she said, "You must have a very strong background in the classics." And my mind started to race. I didn't give the etymology of a word. I had no reference to historical characters in the Greco-Roman tradition, nothing. And I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "Well, first answer the question." I said, "Yes." I said, as a college seminarian, I was a classics major. "Oh, it shows," she said, "it shows." And I said, "And how is that?" And she said, "The thought pattern, the sentence structure, the vocabulary." This was from a 3-minute homily. And she said, "May I ask where you studied?" I said, "Seton Hall." And she said, "Did you have Father Cotter for any courses?" And I said, "Yes, I had him for Homeric Greek." And she said, "Ah, my son." So, and a few months later, I happened to run into Father Cotter, and he said, "I understand you met my mother, and she had to, you had to twist her arm to tell you who I was." But the point is that the overflow value of Latin, and again, all the studies show that kids who have had at least 2 years of Latin perform exponentially better on the verbal section of the SATs. And these are not reasons really to study, but in a very pragmatic culture that we have, that is a selling point to parents who sometimes think, if we're going in this classical direction, that sounds hoity-toity, and is this what we really want our kids to be doing? So enough of that. Kevin, you want to pick up on the application of this more?
Thank you, Father. And I don't know if there's any feedback. Okay, I think we're okay now. Anyway, Mary Pat did an excellent job to take a look at what she did, helping to transition her school into a classical school, and then doing this work on a national level. I just really want to talk about two broad things. Number one, my experience is helping schools to transition from, a regular curriculum and set of standards to classical, both in Denver and Detroit. And then second, I want to talk a little bit broadly about the implications for standards and curricula in our nation's dioceses and our Catholic school systems across the country. Because I think Mary Pat in ICLE is onto something, specifically that, maybe the classical moniker, while it has served its purpose, it could perhaps be broadened a bit. So first, really the classical model of education, it's focused on providing our students an excellent education rooted in the pursuit of truth in science, beauty, in the arts, and goodness in our Catholic faith. In the Catholic classical model of education helps our students to discover knowledge and truth that is ordered, coherent, and integrated, rooted in the wisdom of the past, specifically in Western civilizations such as Greece and Rome. It's interesting, though, because when I speak to a lot of people about classical education, whether here in the Archdiocese of Detroit or elsewhere, I sort of get this thing that, it's about being better than other people. It's about just studying old, dead, profound Greeks and Romans. And yes, we do study Western civilization, but it's not to that end. We really take a look at the wisdom of the past, and we're able to have a classical approach so that we're going to be able to know Jesus Christ more fully, more completely, and be able to serve him better. And as Mary Pat was able to say, children progress through 3 stages of development: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, with the study of Latin, as Father Peter just noted, but also art and music, where it's all integrated throughout all 3 stages. So when we take a look at grammar, logic, and rhetoric, it's very interesting because, in modern day education speak, people love to talk about Bloom's taxonomy and the different levels and the instructional scaffolding and everything else. Well, that's great, but, frankly, that's not an original idea. That idea, for the most part, came from classical education, or, back in the day when the Jesuits really had a very solid educational model. No comment about the current state of Jesuit affairs today. But in Denver and Detroit, let me just talk a little bit broadly, then I'll get into 2 specific examples. This change of actually implementing a classical model was reflected in every classroom as our younger students began to learn things from the heart. So they did drills, chants, songs. They recited various poems, pieces of literature, excerpts, things of that nature. And as students progressed to higher grades, they transitioned from memorizing to engaging in learning activities that helped them connect the dots with what they were learning across academic subjects. And I'm convinced that this approach provides a unique and time-tested way for students to engage in critical thinking, problem solving, and stretching their intellectual capability and capacity. So many people within the educational establishment, both within Catholic education circles and public education circles, and you hear this all the time from bigwigs in private industry that sort of talk about the malaise of our educational system. We need to really stress critical thinking and problem-solving skills. That's true. However, when it comes to problem solving on their end, it's really not necessarily trying to do it the correct way, the time-tested way that classical education does provide students. So before coming to Detroit, being the superintendent, I was a superintendent in the Archdiocese of Denver, and I had the honor and the privilege of working and more so serving Archbishop Aquila. When I arrived in Denver, we already had a classical school, Our Lady of Lourdes. They do an excellent job up there, K through 8 school. When we take a look at Rosemary Anderson, In addition to the pastor over there, Father Brian Larkin, this was something that they embarked upon prior to my arrival, where they said, look, you know, the school, very similar to the story that Mary Pat was going to share, or she did share, where it is in danger of closing. Well, they went through this transition. And as part of this transition, not only did they, of course, appropriately train the faculty, onboard them over time, but they also saw changes in liturgical practice. I still remember, this is after my arrival, Father Brian Larkin giving me a call on my cell phone saying, I'm really thinking about actually going from 1 weekly Mass to 4 weekly Masses with the kids, with adoration on Friday. What do you think? And I said, that's an excellent idea. What does the community think? He told me, well, the community here is sort of split because there's some people that believe that it's taking time away from the classroom. Well, Jesus is the Lord of us all, and he is really our, supreme teacher. He is the master teacher. So I said to Father, certainly from a layman's opinion, to your ears, Father, as the canonical pastor, do as you wish, but I would certainly do it. And if you lose some students, that's how it is. And I got a feeling you'll get more. And indeed, that is what happened over there, Our Lady of Lourdes. They lost, I believe, 20 students. The next year, they gained 40. So there's a net increase of 20. And that school continues to flourish. That school is a waiting list. And actually in Denver, that is for the South region of the Archdiocese, one of the most prolific schools that they have. And I do miss working with them. During my time in Denver as well, I remember working with Archbishop Aquila, and this was sort of a gamble, but it paid off. I saw a charter school that was closing in Thornton, so it's sort of the northern part of the Archdiocese. And that charter school's closing, and so I went to the CFO and I spoke with him and I said, I think we should get that school. We should actually do a role reversal, buy a charter, turn it into a Catholic school, and how about we make it another classical school for the sort of the northern half of the Arch. The Archbishop was very much in favor of that, and we did, and it's still there today, and it's doing really well. It's called Frazzati Catholic Academy. Excuse me, Frazzati Catholic Academy. That particular school, we enlisted the services of ICLE, where they were able to come in. They were able to train the faculty, and we had the messaging right and everything else. And again, it's about truth, beauty, and goodness. And that was such a draw. And then, of course, I leave to come to Detroit. But I'm so pleased to see that in the Archdiocese of Denver, now they actually have a classical high school that they started out there. And things continue to develop. Here in Detroit, we have, and I'm just going to, I guess, get it from behind me over here, a vision that the Archbishop and I published. It's called Unleashing Our Catholic Schools. And within it, we talk about a number of different things. Some of the things, I'm sure most of them you've heard of before, right? If you want to look at it, you could Google it. But one thing specifically that we spoke about within the academic realm is bringing different modalities of Catholic education so that our parents have an option. I'm a free market economist by training through another graduate degree. And I'm like, let really ideas compete in the marketplace. Let programs compete in the marketplace. So what we decided to do, and we started with one school, John Paul II. It's a school in Lincoln Park, and for those that don't know, here in Michigan, southeastern Michigan, still relatively Caucasian, still a lot of Catholics, but it's very, very blue collar. I wouldn't even say middle class. It's maybe lower middle class to middle class. That's where it's sort of the range. But we decided, along with a great pastor out there, Father Beachill, who just became the administrator, let's go ahead and give this a try. So we enlisted ICLE again to train everyone. We made a great, nice announcement to the faculty. They were all very supportive. And then, I think I shared this with Father Peter before. We had a session with all the parents to tell them what this is all about. And they loved it. And then afterward, because remember, this is the very blue-collar area, I had a gentleman walk up to both Father and I afterward. There's a whole bunch of people always want to talk to you, the meeting after the meeting. Man had tattoos up here, some of them visible in his neck. And I'm like, I don't know how this is going to turn out. You know, I have no idea. And he says, you know, I send my kids over here to Catholic school to give them something that I never got. This is really interesting, but I'm kind of afraid, and I'm embarrassed to say this. And we're like, shoot, you know, please tell us what's on your mind. And this parent, this father says, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to help my kids learn. You know, you talk about Latin and how good it is and all the different benefits. I don't know Latin. And I love what Father Beachel did. Father Beachel celebrates both the ordinary and the extraordinary form. And out of an abundance of Christian charity, he's like, how about, you know, maybe on Thursday evenings or whatever the evening was, we can sort of do a refresher or just a primer on some Latin for parents that want to know. And the father, you know, he sort of had a little tear in his eye, but this father later told Father Beachel, or the pastor, you know, and this was conveyed to me later, while he sent his kids to a Catholic school, he really didn't attend Mass with him or with Father, or he certainly didn't bring his family. The only education and exposure to the church that the family had was through the Catholic school. Now Father Beachel reports to me, or shared with me, that this father and family now goes to Mass regularly. It's so interesting. So as Father Peter was able to say, Father Stravinkis was able to say initially during the first day, it's all about reverse evangelization, or I sort of like to say it's guerrilla warfare. You know, you're able to get into the family, because absent education, and certainly classical education, is really difficult to sort of break in and to help. So those were my experiences. And here in Detroit, unfortunately, the pandemic got in the way, and it's not done. It's just on pause. We were going to have another cohort of schools, actually 3 of them, become classical for this upcoming fall. Spoke with Archbishop Vigneron, and we have decided to just table that for a year, but we will be bringing them through that process and re-engaging ICLE at that time. So those are just my experiences. So if I may, I'm going to transition to the second thing and briefly conclude. So the broader implications I see for classical education when it comes to standards, curricula across the diocese in our country. So Mary Pat and I and others, we've had, you know, conversations in various groups or one-on-one. You know, this is not really classical education. I mean, it is in name, but it's really just Catholic education. And I think that there may be an opportunity, without using the moniker or the nomenclature classical, to bring, you know, again, truth, beauty, and goodness really back at the forefront of our Catholic schools, to bring in the pedagogy, to bring back the Latin. And we don't necessarily have to call it classical, because again, it's kind of divisive among the various ideological groups that may hear it, or they may have an opinion or whatever else. I think that, you know, for example, here in Detroit, it's just an idea. It's not something I've broadly discussed. But what I would love to do as we continuously review our academic standards is really to update them to reflect the classical model. And certainly, you know, many schools can become classical with the elements, but they don't necessarily have to call themselves classical. Let's actually make Catholic education great again, you know, and across all different dioceses, across all different places. So that's sort of where I think where we could be headed, because if we continue to follow secular education, and as Mary Pat said, STEM, you know, what is that really doing for our children? Because I talked to a number of different folks, you know, that, for example, they got a great liberal arts education for undergrad. Then they went to law school, or they went to medical school, or they went to engineering school. Yours truly, you know, I think I had a pretty decent liberal arts education for undergrad, and I went to law school. But when you look at, you know, the education, it's really learning, again, how to think, how to actually converse, how to take a look at various conflicting pieces of information and to synthesize an answer that is really grounded on truth and principles. Because STEM I'm going to just come out and say it. It's not that it's bad, but it's not really education. It's more so of a vocation. A lawyer, and no offense to the other folks here in the room that may have a law degree or a medical degree or anything else, it's nothing but a vocation. You're an overglorified mechanic. That's what you are. You know, whether when it comes to filing paperwork or trying to diagnose or treat a disease or an ailment or whatever else. And these folks I'm friends with, you know, they talk about how glad that they were able to get their education prior to getting their trade. And the more that our Catholic schools go down this path of, let's just really prepare people for work, you're missing the education part. And if we miss the education part, I think that Catholic schools, for the most part, have done, in essence, a great disservice to all. So, Father, I'll turn it back to you.
Just one quick item before moving on to Father McManus. You mentioned well that sometimes classical is an automatic turnoff. We have to also be careful that liberal has the same effect on the opposite side of the coin, because unfortunately, when people hear liberal education, if they're of a traditional or conservative bent, they say, I don't want any of that liberal stuff. That's what I'm trying to avoid. And so we really do have to come up with some kind of clever language that can convey both of those ideas without raising ideological red flags. Huh?
Yeah. You're absolutely correct. So, for example, if we take a look at the various announcements that we made regarding a school transitioning from, you know, regular curriculum and standards to one of a classical model, we had to be very explicit. So, you know, very much along the same lines that Mary Pat was able to share earlier about liberals, about freeing the mind, so that we can seek wisdom and more so end up in a position of knowing the truth. We had to be very explicit with that. One other quick comment, if I may, regarding, you know, classical perhaps being a turnoff. This is something that, for example, I won't mention names out of an abundance of Christian charity, but here in the Archdiocese of Detroit, among some members of the Presbyterate, they're like, oh, this is different from Catholic. And what I told them was, it's not. They actually thought that, for example, this is more so of a conservative bent, and it's not about being conservative. All it really is about telling people and sharing with people the truth. And, you know, their bias sort of came through.
Mary Pat, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I was going to say, I just long for the day when we can call it Catholic education.
Yeah.
In essence, what we're talking about is, and I understand we're still in the Coca-Cola position of having to distinguish it, but ultimately that's the goal. So let's pray for that day.
Father Dennis, you want to give some of your insights?
Thank you. If I may, Father Peter, if it's all right, may I pose
You're not very loud.
How's this better?
Is it better? Or?
Well, I can hear you really well, but you can't hear
Okay.
me better?
I can hear you, Father.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I'd like to pose 5 sort of uphill challenges to this kind of classical education model and ask Mary Pat and Kevin if they would respond to them, because I would think that you're going to run into this in a big way, as I have. I was, over the course of 45 years in the classroom, principal of 2 big high schools, every grade of grammar school, all of it. And the movement that you're involved in now is very widely criticized by a lot of people. And I'd like to pose these 5 criticisms to you and ask if you wouldn't mind responding, if that's all right. The first one says this: gosh, I know you're well-intentioned, but you're about to undo something that it's taken us 230 years to accomplish. And that's this. We moved from being religious ghetto schools into assimilated, mainstreamed Catholic schools that have a big influence on our culture. Instead of behaving like we were cloistered yeshiva schools, we were little convent schools for girls, now what we have is a big Catholic school system that's adopted more or less Dewey's educational methods, his epistemology, the order of the day, everything. Citizenship, human formation, and we've added religion to it. So you have Dewey plus Catholicism equals the modern model of a school. And that's what it means for us to have integrated ourselves as Catholic Americans. Do you really want to lose that? Do you want to lose that connection and all those years of fighting for us to become an influential part of American culture by the readaptation of our school system? Isn't that at stake here? How would you answer?
Father Dennis, I think what I would say to that, first of all, is that, you know, this approach is good. That's why it's Catholic. The church takes it up because it's good. It's not Catholic, strictly speaking, in the way I think you're talking about. I'm not sure that the convent schools of the last 100 years were doing this either. So this is a broader human formation. It's for all people. Beauty is for everyone. Truth is for everyone. I will just tell you at a practical level that, you know, I mentioned to you our folks at St. Jerome's who were, you know, very, very, I guess what you would call Orthodox Catholics who wanted this for their kids. And that's been great. But let me tell you who else has come to the school. A lot of secular progressives. A lot of the faculty of the University of Maryland on the other side of us, because they have come to understand that modern education, the John Dewey model as it's expressed today, however egalitarian it may be, has failed to help children learn to think. Children are unable to communicate as they once were. I just saw a statistic the other day that by age, I think the lowest age group, only 34% could pass the citizenship test today for the United States. By almost any measure, and certainly by what we see happening in our culture today, education has failed. And so even secular progressives, I've had people come to the school and say, you know, I'm here because I want them exposed to good literature. I want that Latin for their language. I'll tolerate the Catholic piece, but so it's been no less an integrated approach. In fact, it's drawn people from all over to come to St. Jerome's to experience this. So that would be my response. Kevin?
I would maybe I agree with everything that you said. I would append it with maybe two other quick things. So if responding to an individual, because I had this question posed by some clergy and frankly some members of the philanthropy community, you know, isn't this really a regression? My response would be this, that certainly we're not going to be regressing how the normal school day looks. We're not going back. We're actually restoring. It's kind of like a renaissance of sorts. But really, kids will still be studying math. We'll be studying English. We'll be taking a look at a number of different things that certainly will have implications in society today, but the methodology is a little bit different. And as I have described it to other folks, I believe, again, in the marketplace of ideas and options. So, for example, if someone does not like the idea of attending a classical school, certainly among the educational portfolio here in the Archdiocese with 87 schools, people can be free to choose a different modality if they wish. But that's the first thing. The second thing is going to maybe the second part of my comments. I think that we can certainly, and again, it's not trying to be clandestine, but integrate elements, those real essential elements of classical education into standards and curricula, and not necessarily call it classical. And I still think that folks would very much like it. I can tell you, as part of the doctoral program where I'm at right now, and I'm getting to know my cohort members, let's just say it's pretty liberal. I'm having these conversations with them right now, and they think it would be a regression. So perhaps in future years, whenever I'm done, I'll certainly share the outcome of those conversations, but I'll still always be outnumbered. We just got to stand up for the truth and make sure that people do not see it as a regression, but more so as a modification of how we're offering the educational product. Put it down.
Well, thank you, because that brings up the second one, and maybe we don't need to spend much time on it, but the criticism is this: you have got to be kidding me. This whole thing is totally retro. This is nostalgia. This is some kind of reaching back to what our parents and grandparents might have experienced. This has nothing to do with the present moment. Today, kids don't need Latin. What they need is something else to help them communicate better. But the church let go of Latin for a good reason. Latin's no longer her language. The extraordinary form isn't her way of worship. This is all nostalgia. This is a trip to the past because, frankly, you're a group of educators who are afraid of the future. Mm-hmm. And what you really need to do is come to terms with the neuroses that have given rise to this flight from science-based education.
Mm.
If I may offer a response first, Mary Pat. Certainly in that vein, we have received some of those criticisms. And I don't think it's from a bad place from a lot of people. I would say this. First, in terms of our church, we are members of the Latin Rite. According to the church, all seminarians are supposed to know Latin. And it's actually still the official language of the church, but that's not the reason why we want to teach children Latin. The reason why we want to teach children Latin is so that when it comes to grammar and syntax, they're going to be able to understand the world more fully. They're going to be able to really, as Father Peter was able to say, understand the English language better, to make them better and more critical thinkers. And in terms of the retro argument, certainly, well, we have a lot of great thinkers in history and even today that have gone back to that period. I mean, my goodness gracious, you could take a look at James Madison, the father of our Constitution. I know that may not necessarily be popular to say today in this current environment, or John Adams or any of the other founding fathers, where they actually relied upon the wisdom of Greece and Rome. They didn't adopt everything, but it helped to shape their thinking. The same thing when it comes to a number of different high-tech CEOs today. Where are they sending their children in Silicon Valley? They're actually sending their children, not all of them, but a good number of them, to schools where actually this type of pedagogy, this type of approach, this type of method is embraced, absent technology. So if it's good enough for the CEOs of today, and if it was good enough for those that founded our country, and many people in other eras of our history, why is it not good enough for our children? So that's sort of how I would reply, but I'm sure there'd be a dialogue back and forth. But Mary Pat, I'll hand it off to you.
Here's what I would say. Father Dennis, I agree with you. Nostalgia is a lousy reason to transition a school and go through, all that we went through to do it. So a couple points. One, truth, goodness, and beauty are not bound by time. It's not simply a question of saying that because something's old, it meets those standards. Some old things do, some don't. Some new things do, some don't. It's about discerning those things throughout the entirety of human experience. I think the second thing, as far as science-based, I at St. Jerome's, I hired a scientist to teach science to grades 5 through 8. He holds a PhD in solar physics, has done work for NASA as an adjunct at CUA. This is because in this tradition, we value teachers who have mastery over subjects. Do you know what you get in most of today's science-based schools? You get someone like me, an elementary ed major who had methods in teaching science. That's who's teaching science. I'll take the solar physics doctor any day because he can help to formulate, again, this is a difference about formulating habit and virtue. And Kevin talked about that. He's quite right. It was Steve Jobs of Apple who said it's the marriage of liberal arts and technology that Apple sing. The genius of Apple isn't because of the somebody who's able to construct a microchip. That's done anywhere. Apple's a genius because it intuits human need. And only those who've been formed to observe and to think over time are really able to do that. So the idea that it's not fit for the modern world. And then third and last point I'll make is right now we are living through a time in which we see everything governed by emotion. Everything that's happening out on these streets is driven by emotion. There is no more rational argument. In fact, there are positions that if you were to attempt to articulate it, the mob would be at your door with torches and pitchforks. This is because we have lost discourse and we have lost the ability, in public policy anyway, to reason. This approach to education restores that.
On the retro issue, I would say this. First of all, corresponding to reality and having some degree of humility enables people to evaluate the present and to say, we're not in a good place, all right? And what does it take? Well, if you go to your doctor for your annual checkup and he says, you're 50 pounds overweight, and if you don't lose at least 25 of those pounds in the next 6 months, you're going to have some serious medical problems, and maybe a coroner will be taking care of you instead of me. Well, what is he telling you? He said, you have to go back to the weight you carried maybe 15 or 20 years earlier. And I think we have to be able to say that mistakes have been made in education in general in the country, terrible mistakes, and that unfortunately, in many instances, Catholic education has bought into those mistakes. And so to say, yes, some of this is going back, but it's going back to something that we know worked, and we certainly see that a lot of this doesn't work.
Point two. I hope I'm not pressing too hard.
No, make it harder, Father.
Bring it on. It's all good.
Here's point 3. Where do you people live? Do you live above ground, saying out loud? Do you not see our streets filled with rioters, protesters, people whose rights have been denied? Don't you hear the voice of Black Lives Matter? Don't you hear feminists calling for autonomy over their own bodies? Don't you understand something that keeps you from engaging the modern world properly? And that's this. Your classical curriculum is Western-centered. What we need today is a world-centered, world culture curriculum. People in the West need to know what Afro and Asian and Native American peoples experience first. They need respect for those cultures. They need respect for the learning and the roots of humanity that preceded the West and preceded the colonialization that has taken over the very way you think. In other words, today we need curricula that free us. You want liberal? Let's get liberal. Free us from Western bias, the singular concentration on a concept or two from the West of freedom, of knowledge, of truth. What we need is to open ourselves up to the African, the Asian, and the Indian traditions, which now constitute the world we live in. We no longer live in a world dominated by classical European Western culture. The whole of your movement is based on that, and it's going to fail badly.
You want me to go, Mary Pat, or you want to go?
I can go. I think, first of all, I think it's a principle of learning that one must understand one's own culture first before we can understand those other cultures that you mentioned, Father. And, you know, certainly there's no question we're seeing Europe in decline. But there are many good ideas that are being taken down with it. And it's not the first time that we have been called to preserve certain ideas. We know that Saint Benedict in the monastic system preserved the classics of Greece while the world tumbled into chaos after the fall of Rome. But I would say that classical education does not mean that one doesn't study Africa or Asia or the other cultures. It simply means that one understands what has developed the West. As Kevin said, the principles of the American founding are the result of the, you know, Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman tradition, and it's important to at least understand them. Maybe people will reject it, but at this point, what's happening is we're seeing a rejection of something that people do not understand. You mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I think one of the things that we do better in this tradition is to actually introduce in a powerful way a more longitudinal and deep approach to understanding this. At St. Jerome Academy, which, by the way, you know, it has something around 45% African American students, and has always had a strong number of minority students. Their parents recognize the goodness of this, and they want it for their kids too, because people at the end of the day want something good for their children. But you know, our kids have studied Letter from a Birmingham Jail at a close level, which, by the way, Dr. King positioned the entire civil rights movement in the Christian understanding of moral law. So much of what's happening today stands on the shoulders of a civil rights movement that was deeply steeped in Western understanding. So I don't think it's irrelevant. I would reject that. And I would say that it's just ironic to me. I don't think people in Eastern cultures obsess so much about, you know, making sure their kids study the West first. I think it's pretty well understood. And I think there's nothing wrong with our kids understanding who they are, and then with that understanding, beginning to branch out and study other cultures. That's been, you know, the tradition. One must have learning must move from the general to the more specific in order to be coherent and make sense. But I'll toss it over to Kevin.
Tag team, right? I'm just going to say this very briefly, Father, to that question. If it were posed by, you know, someone else other than you, I would say yes. When we take a look at our streets, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of angry words being exchanged. And it's really unfortunate. Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be efficient? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be good to actually, folks, if people from all different political stripes or ideologies were able to have a civil conversation to work through their issues? No matter what one's political ideology is, I'm sure everyone would agree with that. It would be better, more efficient to actually have a dialogue. And that's what classical education is able to do. It helps individuals to think. It helps people to dialogue, and then inevitably to reach a solution. I think that when we take a look at the violence, when we take a look at the looting, we take a look at the vandalism, and all these other things that are happening, including the People's Republic of Chaz, or whatever it was called in Seattle, certainly those things could be avoided if folks of all stripes, not just liberals, you know, talking about folks on the left end spectrum, but also conservatives, some conservatives, if they were better educated, if they had the tools, the mechanisms, the scaffolding, the resources, and able to do that. And I think classical education is one approach so that we may actually foster and create citizens that can have a more respectful dialogue with each other.
I'll just go to my last one so that we don't use up all the time, but here it comes, all right? You sound like what you're proposing in this new way of doing things is a very close relationship between teacher and student inside of a tradition of living, seeing, worshiping, treating other people. In other words, you're reaching back to a whole kind of community experience. It sounds a little like a Catholic version of something like Montessori or a yeshiva school or a madras or an Amish school, where small is beautiful and it's the community and its values that set the parameters.
Mm-hmm.
All right, if that's what you want, help yourself. But here's my big question. The Catholic Church? Are you kidding me? You know, if I want to send my kids to a school like this, trust is the coin of the realm. Your clergy are abusive. There's corruption everywhere. You're asking me to entrust my kids to a school system supervised and really put into effect and made what it is by abusive teachers, by a culture of corruption. I'm a Protestant. I've watched this stuff go on forever. This was one of the big causes of why we left Rome behind, is corruption. Tell me why, in the modern world and under the abuse crisis, I should trust a small Catholic school with the life of my child. Tell me why your community would be able to raise that child morally and intellectually better than I could get by an insistence on child rights in any public school.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll offer the first response, if you don't mind, Mary Pat. When we take a look over, the past 50 years plus, there have been institutional failures at every level in all different types of organizations. When we take a look at the Catholic Church, as the magisterium teaches, is perfect, but certainly there are problems when it comes to various individuals that serve in the church. Certainly, I don't have to remind anyone here about the Borgias or taking a look at Alexander VI, but we've had some bad leaders from time to time, and certain things have happened. But what I can tell you or share with you is this, that certainly when it comes to classical education, it's about truth, beauty, and goodness. And certainly when we take a look at public school institutions or districts, there have been massive failures, whether it's corruption, whether it's actually violations of bodily integrity and all these other things. Much more rampant over there. But again, it's not a deflection. It's just a response to say that there are institutional failings, more so people within these institutions all across the country. But with a specific model of classical education, I believe and I know when we take a look at our students and the academic outcomes that we have, we're able to raise kids in a safe, nurturing, welcome, and warm environment. I'll give it to you, Mary Pat.
Sure. I think to add on to what Kevin said, public schools have hardly been bastions of care for the integrity of the child, as Kevin pointed out. One of the things that I think is a great strength is, and you may have heard, picked up on this in the St. Jerome Vision Plan, is first of all, because much of the work of a school like St. Jerome's is about bringing back to the fore what the church teaches about education, that idea that the parent is the primary educator is at the forefront. So St. Jerome's is very deliberate in wanting to bring families into the life of the school and school into the life of the family. Now, and I'm going to tell you, this is a reaction to it, the us versus them that has developed in public schools. You'll often go into public school settings where there are signs saying no parents beyond this point. You wouldn't see that at my school, ever. And there tends to be a sense of, we saw it this past spring when the kids all went home. Public schools took them a month or longer to be able to make a transition to learning. It took most of our Catholic schools a weekend. Why? Because they are smaller, they are more community-based, there is a greater deal of subsidiarity, and there's already strong relationship between parents and teachers. So we were able to be a lot more seamless in that. So I think, that particular objection, I think, just isn't the case in this model of school.
Thank you. I want to stop being a nightmare critic.
I Aren't we glad? Aren't we glad to have Father Dennis on our side?
Great.
Thank you to both of you for what you do. You answered well, and what comes through is the genuineness of your faith and the absolute Catholicity of what you do and what you teach and how you want to see that integrated for the good of kids. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Father.
A couple of addenda. We're talking about introducing children to the Catholic culture and tradition and heritage. And there are two important ways that can be done independent of even moving a curriculum in this direction, or at least perhaps, let's say, as first steps toward that. And, you know, we talk about the fact that it's important that there be religious art in the school. Well, what does that mean? It means, for us, it should mean putting children in touch with a millennium and more of Catholic Christian religious art, the masterpieces. So not the Corita Kent posters from 1970. Father Dennis is enjoying that. You knew her, didn't you? From LA. So, but, you know, Botticelli and Fra Angelico, all of these wonderful, wonderful pieces of classical Christian art. That's what should be dotting the walls of our halls, of our classrooms, and so forth. And then secondly, our school masses. You know, I said earlier about, you know, getting rid of the Haagen-Dazs music, which, you know, brings us nowhere and has no effect on anybody after a while. No one can remember any of it. Most of it is unsingable also. But to introduce children to Gregorian chant and Renaissance polyphony and sort of Anglican hymnody, that's a good trio right there. And you say, well, that's not possible. Kids don't like it. That's absolutely false. When I would teach kids just some of the basics of some mass chants, the Kyrie, the kids you would find them in the corridors and singing it to each other. All right. They love that kind of stuff. But if you want to see this in action, go to the website of Atonement Academy in San Antonio. It's the first Anglican youth parish in the country, and 25 years ago, I helped them open that school. And they've had this approach to education long before anybody was really talking about it. But go and click on their student body masses. They have mass every day, Monday to Friday. It's the Anglican youth liturgy. And on Friday, Monday to Thursday rather, and on Friday, it's the ordinary form Latin Mass. And the music that those kids can do is unbelievable, right? And they enjoy doing it. Traditionally, the 8th grade gift to the 12th grade graduates is they will sing a polyphonic baccalaureate Mass. And they're doing all of these wonderful, wonderful musical compositions, which elevates everything. And so it's taking the classical idea and incarnating it in the lived experience of these kids. So the music for the liturgy, the art for the visual aspect, and so forth. So anybody else have observations about this whole approach?
I have a question from Pat. One of the things you talked about, the importance of the pastor and how he has to be on board with it. And my old friend, Father Stack, I can picture him in his bib overalls coming back from a rugby game and teaching the kids Latin. Mm-hmm. But what I'm wondering, what would happen, though, if you set up someplace with the pastor's approval and you've got it rolling and that pastor gets transferred and someone else comes in who says, I like what Father McManus said in his objections. I liked his approach. Why are we doing this? What happens then?
Well, actually, Father, we've been through that. Father Stack was transferred out of St. Jerome's back in 2015. And I was, of course, fervently praying. And the pastor who was placed in, I'm going to say this. He's no great fan of this, not naturally inclined toward it. He was very pessimistic and cynical. And I had to spend a lot of time although he wasn't as sharp as Father McManus, I had a lot of conversations with the new pastor. What's been interesting about it is we prayed this would happen, but he has been won over by this approach. And the main reason that Father's been won over is what he calls the engagement and joy of the children. It's unmissable. And I think the second piece, let's face it, guys, we know how pastors think. The bottom line looks really good. We have 415 kids in that school. So the budget's in good shape. It's operating well into the black, and he knows enough not to disturb it. But we certainly have been through that, Father, and I think there probably are cases where that has caused a school to lose that forward momentum. But if it's going well, and if families love it, and they do, then our experience at St. Jerome's has been, this new pastor's been there these 5 years, school's still going strong. So there's hope.
Father John's concern goes back to something that we said at the very beginning of this seminar. Clergy assignments need to be intentional.
Right. And
for a bishop to put a man in there without knowing that man's orientation, interest, and so forth is self-destructive. And so the very fact that you had to have that learning curve, that someone might say, I don't know anything about this, educate me, is one thing. But that someone would say, I don't like this, automatically you're in an adversarial position. And that shouldn't be the case. Kevin?
Yeah, just two other things to what you just said, Father, in addition to Mary Pat. I'm very fortunate back in Denver with Archbishop Aquila and here with Archbishop Vigneron that they were receptive to my request that I be placed on the priest personnel board for assignments. I only opine, of course, and offer an opinion when asked when it comes to a parish with a school. We only need to place men, good men, at places with Catholic schools if they want to Catholic schools. So that's number one. But just assuming arguendo, we don't necessarily have that as, the praxis or the practice within a particular diocese. There is a second line of defense, and that is, for example, if I take a look at John Paul II here in Detroit, or Frazzati Catholic Academy when we started that out in Denver, we actually have boards in place, and governing boards at that, not advisory boards. So we actually had a fiduciary governing board at Frazzati Catholic Academy because it was an archdiocesan elementary school K-8. John Paul II, we have a board of specified jurisdiction with canonical statutes in place, where the only individual that can really undo it or cease it to the rubbish bin of history is the Archbishop or the ordinary himself. So gentlemen know what they're going to be getting into. And in my experience, ever so brief in these various places, I think that if we place the right man in the right place, if they want to be there, that's number one. And then number two, with the boards, if gentlemen come and they see how well that governing structure works, they're not going to undo it, or at least try to attempt to go to the Archbishop to undo it. And this is something, granted, it's a whole other topic for another segment or another time, but if we have good governing structures at all of our parochial schools, we're going to be fine. And one thing that we will be doing in the Archdiocese of Detroit in consultation with, of course, the Archbishop, the ultimate boss here, is to actually have boards of specified jurisdiction where delegation of various powers, with the exception of Catholic faith, mission, and identity, are going to be delegated to a board for each one of our schools. And this will happen really over a 2 to 3 year staggered period. So we can ensure the continuous operation and make sure that we minimize interruptions or speed bumps to the effective management of the school.
Kevin, I may ask you to weigh in on some of the governance model in the next segment when we talk about finances, because they're sort of intimately connected. Anybody else on the classical angle? All right, well, let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 11:15. Thank you, Mary Pat. Thank you, Father Dennis, the instigator. And we'll come back and look at the finance question. I'd like to make, to finish our conversation on the classical front, and someone mentioned about thinking, and we do a lot of talk today about critical thinking. And on that same visit to Mary Pat's school, to St. Jerome's, I walked into a fourth grade class, and I asked, "What are you studying now?" And they said World War II, and the teacher immediately intervened and said, "Now, Father, we just started it today, so don't expect too much." And I said, "Well, what can you tell me about World War II?" And they already knew the Axis and Allied sides and so forth. And I said, "Okay, well, let me ask you another question. Now, put on your thinking caps. Why did World War II happen?" And this little fourth grader said, "Because they didn't end World War I right." Well, what a tremendous understanding of things, huh? That's critical thinking. So they know the facts. I mean, the first problem in most educational settings today, they don't even know the facts. These kids know the facts, and they know how to interpret them and connect the dots. So I think that's one of the big points to make. And they get that critical thinking by reading real literature and being led through the process of reflecting on those classical texts. So, okay.
Father,
Yeah.
just a question. Kevin knows where I am at. I'm the pastor of the parish that is on the border between Detroit and Grosse Pointe in Michigan. Has there been a study done whether the African American community is more prone to the classical versus liberal arts perception for their students, their children? Because predominantly my school is an African American, and I'm just wondering if that shift is to happen, how is the community of the African American parents, accepting this or seeking this versus the liberal arts, when parents are more, perhaps here in Detroit, are more tuned to give the tools to the children's hands to survive in the very difficult economic situation that they find themselves in.
Well, I'm not aware of any studies. I don't know if anybody else is weigh in on it. Sure. But I can say this, back in the late 70s as a seminarian, I was vice principal of an inner city parish school in Trenton, and the school population was 1/3 white, the historic families that had been there, and it had been the flagship parish of the diocese, 1/3 Hispanic and 1/3 Black Baptists. And the Black parents wanted only the best, and they believed that what's best, and they were very willing to go along with whatever we thought best was. And we had eschewed all of the ridiculous educational gimmicks that were being offered in the 70s, and all of the state schools around us had all of that stuff, and they knew that that wasn't working. And so when they came to us and we told them what we were doing, which, without calling it classical, in effect, that's what we were doing, and they were extraordinarily supportive of the whole thing. So I think if you can tell them and show them that it works, that's what they're concerned about. And I must say, I never, ever had a problem with a Black parent, either about curriculum or discipline. In fact, sometimes they thought our discipline wasn't enough. So I don't see a problem there. at all. And because they're on the ground, they know the mess of the culture, right? And one of the first reasons they're sending their kids to us is because they see it as an exit strategy from the lunacy in the overall culture. Huh? Monsignor, you dealt with that at Sarah. Huh?
I lost you for about 3 minutes, and so I missed the last part of the, and I didn't get the whole question because it came in staticky. But
he was concerned about, he's got a large black population in the community, and he's wondering if they would be turned off by this classical approach.
My experience was if you provide, well, background, the school that I went to was, when I got there, was 78% African American, and when we increased enrollment, brought in more Latinos, it still was majority African American, maybe 60%, 65%. And as the reputation of the school improved, discipline-wise, academic-wise, community, even we became more Catholic, more liturgies, Eucharistic adoration. And even though half the school is not Catholic, it didn't faze them at all. In fact, they liked it. We had ministers' kids. We had a Lutheran priest whose wife was the secretary of the Lutheran bishop. I mean, they loved the fact that we knew who we were and that we were living out the mission. So I don't think if you have the reputation established or built to that point to where they love your school, you can bring on the classical, I'm sure, and convince them that this is the way to go, and give them all the examples of the success stories around the country, and it would work. But if the school is struggling right now, and you have some hostility on the part of the black parents because they don't feel they're being served properly, then you gotta fix that first.
I would just append it with this very quick comment. So when it comes to Father Andrew, where he's at and where I am, we're actually only about a mile apart. I could actually take a 3-minute drive to get over to see Father at the rectory or at the office. But he is in Grosse Pointe, right on the border with Detroit, and many of those Detroit parents, and again, it's not a terrible neighborhood where they come from. It's called East English Village, but more middle of the class African Americans that come over. I'm not aware of any studies, but in more practical terms from, I would say, recent years, I wish Mary Pat were here, but she'd be willing to speak with you, Father, I'm almost certain. She actually led an effort, and ICLE led an effort to take a predominantly Latino and African American school through the classical curriculum. And they actually had an increased enrollment. I believe it's somewhere in California. I don't know if it's the Archdiocese of Los Angeles or not, but I do know it's somewhere in California. And great success. So I think that if structured the right way, and we talk about how we are giving them an education that rivals even Cranbrook public schools. I'm sorry, the Cranbrook Academy, which is like our most expensive school here in Michigan. I'm sure that they would go for it. So I'll be willing to speak with you more, Father, and connect you with folks so you can learn more about it. Happy to.
A note, I think you might be referring to Holy Innocents School in East Long Beach. It's a very, very poor neighborhood, almost completely Latino, though there would be African Americans there. Mm-hmm. And the pastor, a very traditional priest who goes in and rebuilds parishes and turns them around. This is the second parish where he's transformed it into a beautiful, thriving community. Mm-hmm. But he wanted to go classical, and it's a couple of years now they've done it. He happened to have the Carmelite sisters there, and a lay principal, and all the teachers took the workshops, and the parents bought into it, and now they're considering, well, I shouldn't say, but thinking about the idea of moving up a grade each year past 8th grade. Mm-hmm. That'd be, I guess, a confidential thing, but we got to see if the powers above will allow that. But the community has accepted it wholeheartedly. But it's more Latino than African American. But I think if they feel that they're getting something very special and that's going to help their kids, they'll embrace it.
And nothing succeeds like success. That's the one thing that I found in dealing with both the Latino and Black communities was a confidence in us. And so it's not like the snooty suburban types that they're going to tell you what you should be doing. It was the exact opposite. They would say, you know, you have the competence, you have the track record, help us. And as I say, it was always very, very positive.